In this podcast episode, host and guest Gurwinder Bhogal engage in a wide-ranging conversation dissecting various intricate aspects of human nature and society. The discussion spans topics from the paradoxical relationship between empathy and cruelty, the psychological impact of naming disorders, to the evolving dynamics of online communities and misinformation. They explore behavioral genetics, agency in the age of AI, and insights into personal growth, optimism, and political psychology. Together, these themes offer a complex, sometimes uncomfortable lens on how humans behave individually and collectively in the modern world. Gurwinder Bhogal presents the Oxytocin Paradox, revealing that oxytocin, often called the love hormone, can paradoxically fuel cruelty as much as compassion. Empathy is not an all-encompassing good, but rather a selective spotlight directed towards in-groups, often accompanied by hostility towards out-groups. This tribal nature of empathy explains why groups known for high compassion, such as social justice activists on platforms like Blue Sky, can simultaneously support violent actions against perceived enemies. Empathy's zero-sum dynamic, intense concern for one group, paired with disregard or hatred for another, underlies political violence and extremism. Bhogal illustrates this through examples spanning political terrorism, online activism, and jihadist groups, emphasizing that compassion is intrinsically linked to tribal loyalty and often adjacent to cruelty. The key takeaway is the need for expanding empathy beyond selective tribes in an effort to reduce tribalistic antagonism. This concept derives from the folktale where naming the imp gives power over it, metaphorically connecting to psychological diagnoses. Naming psychological suffering, such as depression or anxiety, imbues it with meaning that can make it more manageable, even if the diagnosis is imperfect or medically questionable. The surge in mental health diagnoses reflects this human need to frame suffering in definable terms. Bhogal explains that while labels can offer a pathway toward understanding and treatment, they risk becoming excuses that inhibit action if the diagnosis stagnates progress. Medicalization, driven by aligned incentives between needy patients and profit-motivated industries, inflates diagnoses and pathology, sometimes birthing fictitious disorders or expanding conditions beyond reasonable boundaries. He underscores the delicate balance where naming should motivate therapeutic action rather than become a refuge for resignation. Bhogal highlights a growing phenomenon in educational contexts where disability claims disproportionately come from affluent individuals seeking advantages, especially in elite American universities. He illustrates that with rising benefits and diminishing stigma, the rewards for claiming disability have sometimes eclipsed the costs, leading to fabrication and misrepresentation. This trend undermines genuine disabled individuals, breeding skepticism towards all disability claims, particularly those less visibly apparent. The consequence is a cynical culture that erodes trust and harms those truly in need, illustrating how systemic incentives can distort social policies and community dynamics. The podcast addresses the proliferation of AI-produced content and its superior persuasive capacity compared to humans. This saturation risks creating an environment saturated in slop, overwhelming misinformation and rage bait that may not persuade towards specific narratives, but instead fosters reality apathy. As people face conflicting information in vast volumes, the cognitive cost to discern truth rises, incentivizing disengagement from accuracy altogether. Bhogal argues that societal collapse is less about belief in falsehood and more about declining trust and willingness to pursue truth. In this evolving digital landscape, AI acts as an amplifier of both intelligence and stupidity, reflecting human biases and faults rather than superseding them. The discussion points to the urgent need to cultivate a collective valuation of truth despite the enticing ease of manipulation. Social media platforms are dominated by a small, hyperactive minority, producing the majority of content. Bhogal remarks that this 1% rule means what users encounter online is unrepresentative of humanity, reflecting instead the voices of obsessive, often narcissistic individuals with psychopathic and low intellectual traits. Even well-intentioned users tend to be dragged towards regression and reduction of average discourse quality. This distortion fosters echo chambers and radicalization, producing fragile and increasingly extreme beliefs disproportionate to reality. The dynamic produces a toxic environment, intensifying societal polarization and undermining genuine dialogue. Recursive red pill learning describes the self-reinforcing cycle in which extreme and unrepresentative narratives online, amplified by algorithms prioritizing attention-grabbing content, shape perceptions over time. As individuals consume predominantly polarizing or sensational viewpoints, their beliefs become increasingly antagonistic and divorced from real-world norms. Bogle recounts first-hand observations over a decade on social media of users becoming more extreme and unhinged, reflecting how internet culture drives a feedback loop of radicalization, exemplified by ongoing civil unrest fears and sensationalized political discourse that contrast with lived realities. The conversation challenges prevailing beliefs that comfort maximizes well-being, emphasizing that enduring discomfort and stress is essential for building mental resilience and true happiness. Bogle describes how eustress, productive stress that challenges and improves an individual, is beneficial, while pointless stress derived from uncontrollable external factors is harmful. Resilience born from meeting challenges underpins a contented life, as life's inevitable vicissitudes test mental strength. This perspective ties into the maxim, automate only the skills you're willing to lose, cautioning that reliance on convenience or automation can reduce growth and agency. Bogle raises concerns about outsourcing cognitive effort to AI, drawing parallels to Plato's ancient worry that writing impairs memory. The Google effect suggests ready access to information can diminish mental retention. A study signposted in the discussion warns that heavy AI use may degrade learning and recall, inciting fears of brain rot. The antidote lies in preserving personal agency, the deliberate effort to engage, learn, and grow intellectually. Bogle foresees a bifurcated future where highly agentic individuals use AI to augment themselves exponentially, while passive users devolve further into dependence, exacerbating social inequality. Individuals tend to perpetually feel inadequate because their internal standards evolve alongside their growing capacities. This constant outstripping of perceived ability drives ongoing self-improvement, but also produces chronic dissatisfaction. Bogle relates this to hedonic adaptation at the skill level. As people advance, their benchmarks shift, producing a treadmill effect. Recognizing this paradox is essential to managing expectations and maintaining motivation without falling into despair. Objective metrics rather than shifting subjective benchmarks provide a steady framework for self-assessment. Rothbard's law postulates that people undervalue their natural talents because those talents come easily, while they elevate difficult pursuits as more meaningful. Bogle explains how this misconception leads many to specialize in areas they struggle with rather than those they excel in. The remedy, he suggests, is simple: pursue what you love. Passion generates motivation, which fosters skill development, regardless of innate ability. Enjoyment coupled with effort creates a sustainable path to fulfillment, contrasting with frustration-driven work that drains purpose. The episode explores how individuals' worldviews are reflections of their character and choices rather than objective reality. Citing Emerson and Dylan O'Sullivan, Bogle argues that opinions and misinterpretations unconsciously reveal personal traits. Furthermore, optimism can be a deliberate choice, where focusing on positive aspects is an act of agency, not delusion. Pessimism often masks internal dissatisfaction rather than providing clarity. This choice in perception profoundly influences well-being, underscoring the role of mental framing in navigating life's challenges. Derived from Admiral James Stockdale's experience as a POW, this paradox reconciles realism with hope. Bogle articulates that surviving hardship requires acknowledging potential suffering, pessimism, while cultivating confidence in one's capacity to endure, optimism. This balance prevents despair from false hope or paralysis from fatalism. The core insight is that confidence does not promise perfect outcomes, but assures competence in managing adversity. Preparing for the worst allows hopeful engagement with the present. Bogle analyzes how opposing political factions often feed off each other's extremism in a cycle of escalating outrage and violence. He likens this to a man-beam, infinite mirror, reflecting and reinforcing radical behavior. This dynamic is observable both in the tactics of governments and insurgent groups, as well as within domestic left-right conflicts. Without long-term strategic thinking, short-term reactive escalation perpetuates a spiral that corrodes societal stability and deepens divisions. The conversation turns to how humans misjudge technological impact, overestimating short-term effects while underappreciating long-term transformation. The Gartner hype cycle explains this via a predictable arc of inflated expectations, disillusionment, quiet development, and eventual widespread adoption. Bhogal traces AI's trajectory as a textbook example: decades of relative obscurity followed by sudden explosive visibility with models like ChatGPT. Future advances, such as world models integrating real-world physics, could usher in another hype wave. Understanding this cycle tempers both excessive enthusiasm and nihilistic skepticism. Bhogal discusses how heritability of traits like IQ and personality rises with age, a phenomenon known as the Wilson effect. Early life environments suppress genetic influences, which become clearer as individuals gain independence and can live according to innate predispositions. This explains why some nurture effects appear stronger in youth but decrease with time. Recent studies also revealed genetic contributions to traits like lifespan may be significantly underestimated, highlighting the complexity and timing-dependent nature of gene-environment interactions in human development. The episode revisits the erosion of trust in a landscape saturated with misinformation, noting that misinformation itself isn't new, but the scale and velocity have intensified. Bhogal stresses that a stable society isn't contingent on universal truth, but critically dependent on trust, the social glue that enables cooperation. The abundance of conflicting narratives and the costliness of verifying facts fosters disinterest in truth, culminating in a cultural embrace of ambiguity which threatens social cohesion. The discussion confronts fears that internet content will soon be predominantly produced by AI. Bhogal challenges this by asserting that much online content is already repetitive, derivative, and uncritically regurgitated by humans. Viewed this way, AI is just an extension or acceleration of existing human behaviors rather than a novel force. The critical difference, he notes, is the degree of agency. Humans can choose to think critically, while AI mimics patterns. Thus, the meaningful distinction between human and AI content lies in human agency. Bhogal introduces the caution: automate only the skills you're willing to lose, linking back to the importance of learning through challenge. Automation decreases friction, but simultaneously undermines retention and growth by eliminating the stressful effort necessary to ingrain skills. He references recent research indicating that outsourcing cognitive tasks to technology can reduce memory and learning, posing risks for both individual development and collective intelligence. Proactive engagement and resisting convenience's pull are necessary to maintain and grow capacities. Looking ahead, Bhogal forecasts a bifurcation in humanity shaped by technology. Those with high agency will harness AI to exponentially expand their capabilities, while low-agency individuals will become increasingly passive, outsourcing decision-making entirely. Echoing the Morlocks and Eloi from H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, this division may create new social castes defined by intellectual and practical autonomy. He emphasizes that agency, not intelligence or knowledge, is the non-fungible resource that will determine individual and collective survival in a rapidly changing world. Drawing from political philosophy, Bhogal explains how individuals often advocate for social systems, imagining themselves as beneficiaries rather than as ordinary members. Far-left proponents envision themselves as planners in a managed economy, while far-right supporters imagine aristocratic status. Historically, revolutions and regime changes have shown this assumption to be flawed, with elites often purged or displaced. John Rawls's Veil of Ignorance counters this by proposing decisions be made without knowledge of one's eventual status, leading to more equitable social designs. Adding a pragmatic political caution, Bhogal advocates against granting governments any power you would not want wielded by your political opponents. He argues that policies should be evaluated not only by their immediate benefits, but also by their potential misuse when regimes change hands. The failure to consider this leads to short-term thinking and eventual harm, as regulatory and coercive tools can be weaponized by future adversaries, ultimately undermining freedom and stability. Bhogal and the host conclude with reflections on how people's interpretations of the world serve as windows into their character. Perception, especially selective attention, shapes one's experience of reality and often reveals underlying values and dispositions. Choosing optimism or pessimism reflects an individual's agency and mindset more than objective conditions, reaffirming the central role of personal responsibility in mental framing and the pursuit of meaning.